Hello. Sorry I couldn't be there in person. I'm here in central New York in the United States. I would much rather be in Parma, though I'm guessing it's kind of warm over there. And hopefully at some point during your program I'll get a chance to meet in person. I'm an associate professor in the iSchool, the Syracuse University School of Information Studies. I'm also the director of our Library and Information Science program, as well as the director of the Information Institute of Syracuse, which is a research center that's done a lot of work in the area of education, information, digital libraries, librarianship in general. Anna Marie has asked me to join you virtually, and then hopefully I'll join you for a conversation afterwards, on talking about some of the future trends and the areas we're working on towards developing digital libraries in the future. Before I go too far into this, I'd just like to sort of start where I'm going to end, which is a quote by Alan Kay, and he said that the best way to predict the future is to invent it. So I don't really see myself as the future guy. I see myself as the present guy because I'm much more interested in changing what we're doing now and changing what we're going to do in the future rather than predicting what will happen to us. I think that ultimately you and I are in control of what digital libraries will look like, and so I hope we spend some time thinking about how to really get it right. So I'd like to share with you some of my thinking on that, and then, like I say, we can have a conversation. All right, so just to continue doing this backwards, I'm going to begin my presentation with where I'm going to end my presentation. So there are my conclusions. You can take a look at them as you wish. That the future of digital libraries is a matter of conceptual foundations, not technology. The existing technology, and we'll talk about it at the beginning here, the existing way that we're developing technology, what those standards are, digital library technology, what's available to you to develop, what resources you can put in play, will serve either a sort of open and participatory approach, which I'm going to promote, or a closed, curated collections. The same technologies will work if we want to create a way that's based on people, based on knowledge, based on learning and how people interact. Those technologies will also serve if we learn to define digital libraries as collections of materials and objects and things. We'll talk about what I mean by that in a moment. I really don't see a huge need to develop a whole suite of brand new technologies. I think they're there already. Let me show you what I mean. So let's talk about sort of foundation technologies available to build digital libraries today and tomorrow. I think there's one stream, if you will, one set of technologies and development that's coming out around XML. It's actually pretty mature right about now. Things like XML itself and XML applications such as HTML5 for video and markup and transmitting information, as well as the whole suite of web services and web service architecture based on XML, what used to be SOAP and then became XML RPC, and these days is all about REST and RESTful interfaces, where what we're doing is talking about how do we exchange rich and structured data over the internet, over the HTTP protocol, and cascading style sheets for making it all look pretty when it gets there. That's one set of technologies that's very mature, that's out there. There are a lot of good tools. There's a lot of good ability for us to take advantage of it. I think it's a core set of tools that we need to be aware of when we're building digital libraries. Another stream, another set of technologies being developed are the whole metadata stream. So this is a set of technologies that's not so much about software and not at all about hardware. It's much more sort of conceptual tools, but they're being implemented in standards. That's where we get RDF, the Resource Description Framework. We get OWL, the Web Ontology Language, which I think is a little too crunchy. I'm not a big fan of OWL. RDA for doing descriptions of taxonomies and classification languages, and so we'll get into Dublin Core and all those kinds of things. That's out there. I don't think we need to start again. I lived through one set of metadata wars. I don't look forward to living through another set. I think they're there. They work very well. Thank you very much. There's the database stream, which is very mature technology. I mean, we're going way back to mainframe days, and it still works. The good old relational database is still out there and still serves as the core of a lot of what we do. either if you're in an open source language and you're working in MySQL or Postgres, or if you're in proprietary systems working in things like Oracle. Relational databases are mature, they work, they're still behind a lot of what we do. Moving to object-oriented systems, so that increasingly we're talking about non-relational models, we're dealing with metadata schemas, we're dealing with objects that we can move and manipulate and move around. So that stream technology, once again, is going to serve our needs regardless of what kind of system that we're building. I think that the sort of least mature of the technologies that are out there for us to build digital libraries around and with today are the cloud technologies, cloud stream, but it's clearly a vector that we're heading into. We used to talk about distributed computing and storage systems and grid computing. Now we call it all cloud storage. But everything from Amazon's back-end technology to Google's back-end technology to network-wide storage, we can build very large systems with very large storage and database and carrying capacity without having to build all that infrastructure ourselves. So that's a technology I think we have in our back pocket. And I think increasingly, if we want to throw into the cloud stream, we've got all of these RESTs and APIs and Google Maps and all these different technologies we can take advantage of. And the last set of technologies I see as a sort of core function to when we're building digital libraries is the language stream. And that is when we look at the sort of programming computer languages that we're using, we're moving more and more away from traditional compiled technologies in C and C++ and these kinds of things to increasingly interpreted languages and virtualized languages. Everything from the low-end PHP, which frankly is serving some pretty major parties these days, from Facebook on to Wikipedia, to JavaScript, to JSP if you want to work in the whole Tomcat and Java world. So we're seeing that that kind of trend is going to continue as well. We're really looking at no longer having to build hard-coded, hardcore to the machine kinds of languages and technologies. We're dealing with interpreted languages. We can move much quicker. We can change technology. Really, the other thing that's clear from all of these streams is that they form a sort of independent stack of technologies. So we can pick the ones we want, and we can switch them out without disturbing the one above or below it. So we can build all our PHP scripts and then switch out the cloud system that we're using. We can build all of our relational database and change the interpreted language that's reaching in and doing the different database manipulations. So these technologies are mature. They're there. You're going to learn a lot about them. I'm not going to teach you a lot about them. I'd be glad to talk more about it in our discussion, but it's there. And my point about all of these technologies is that they can support, once again, a very closed system. They can support a very buttoned-down system. They can support things that are all about documents and objects, or they can support Facebook and social services and all of these things. And the technologies have not changed. They're also very mature. So the days of digital library learning being intensively about let's invent a new repository system, I think, are gone. I think now we're talking about adoption, manipulation, and looking at what we're going to do with that technology. Which leads me to my second part, which is these technologies are going to exist no matter what kind of digital library we build. What's really going to differentiate, I think, the digital libraries we have built to this point and the digital libraries we need to build into the future are not these technologies. They're going to work in both worlds. It's what we start with. What's the major assumption that we work with? What are we really trying to build? Right? And it all comes down to this word. Right? What's our base assumption about the word library? I know that sounds, sort of ridiculous, and I could try very poorly to put this in multiple languages, but what do we mean by this digital library? We know what the digital part is. What's the library part? Well, a lot of them start with this basic definition: a building or a room containing a collection of books, periodicals, and sometimes films, and recorded music for people to read, borrow, and refer to. Yeehaw, right? And I think that to put this in a graphic way, we think about something like this. Now, it may be more. I don't know how it could be more grand than this. This is in Stockholm. It could be less grand than this. It could be a couple of shelves in a building somewhere. But we sort of picture the idea of a place that we go that has lots of resources. And so I think a lot of the attempts to build digital library was a place to go in a digital network to get lots of resources, to get lots of stuff. This is an artifact-centric view of a library, and it's frankly really, really widespread. Not only widespread among libraries in general, it's very widespread in the developed world and the developing world. It's very widespread in just about every sector I've looked at. In every nation I've gone to, there's the assumption the library's got stuff to it. And so there's a logic that comes with this. And the logic goes something like this. That if you have a lot of stuff, you need to put it somewhere. And you can't just put it randomly there. You need to organize where it goes. And so if you get the stuff, the place to put it, and you get the way of organizing it, you've got a library. Ta-da! And this is a base assumption, I think, around a lot of traditional libraries, but I think a lot of digital libraries as well. So let's take this base assumption, that a library consists of objects, where we put those objects, how we organize those objects, and let's follow this sort of logic forward. And it goes something like this. So if we have more books, more objects, then we have to inventory them, right? So after a certain number of these things, we just can't keep them all in our head. So we need to create some sort of inventory so that we can look up if we have it and where it is. The larger that inventory, the bigger that inventory becomes, eventually we can't just have a simple, alphabetical listing of it. We need to create some sort of classification around it. So once we get over 200 books in a traditional library, we start saying, I can't remember it, and I don't remember the title, so now I want to put fiction over here and nonfiction over here. Now we have 500 books, and so I now want fiction over here and nonfiction, but nonfiction I'm going to break into the sciences and the arts, and fiction over here I'm going to break into historical fiction and science fiction and literary fiction. So we begin to classify those resources in order to speed and improve access to the materials. Now, when these classifications get rich enough, get sophisticated enough, when we're dealing with thousands of objects, suddenly we can't just have anyone doing this. We need to really put some thought into how we classify these things. And so we talk about this idea of a professional, right? This is where librarians come in. Where we begin to talk about things like, well, is this historical fiction? Is this historical fiction of the 1800s or the 1700s? And is that the best place to put it, or is it really part of literary fiction? And so suddenly we build very sophisticated classifications. A large classified inventory eventually gets too big for us to do it in paper, so we need automation. We bring in technology, so now we can have the computers do it. We build online catalogs and such. And that automation means that once we have it in digital form, we can network them together, build union catalogs, swap metadata systems. And so eventually, if we're going to do that, if we're going to share this kind of high classified inventory information around, we need standards to do it. And so we must begin to standardize MARC, Dublin Core, metadata schema, what have you. Now, really quickly, and it's pretty easy to translate this into a functional logic of digital librarianship, which goes, the more digital objects, and services. We'll get back to services in a minute because oftentimes it's an afterthought, requires an inventory. So we get more, once we have 15 files on our server, suddenly we need to put in folders, and folders create subfolders, and you get the point. The larger inventory requires a metadata schema to do it, because we've learned very quickly that digital objects have lots of different facets or parts that we want to describe, not just its aboutness, its subject, but we want to describe things like its format, its physical format or logical format. We want to say, is it an MP3 file, or is this an Ogg Vorbis file, or is this an MP4 file, is this an HTML file, is it an XML, what's the schema that goes with it? So now we need a schema. That large schema and inventory then require a repository. It's not enough to simply have some flat file of all the different objects and all the different formats, but suddenly we need to have that in a structured way. We need to manipulate that data in new and interesting ways, almost always a database sitting under there. And then we know that schema and repositories can be networked together, and that these networks require standards. XML, XML-RPC, do we do Dublin Core back and forth? This is Open Archives initiatives, etc. Now, if we sort of take a look out there in digital library land, where has this logic gotten us? Some would argue it has gotten us very far. I would argue that it's gotten us into a really interesting dead end. But let's take a look for a moment. The results of this digital library functional logic are things like the Open Archives initiatives, things like Dublin Core. And by the way, I throw GEM in there. GEM is the Gateway to Educational Material, to show that I'm not, without blame here. GEM was a Dublin Core standard to describe educational resources primarily in the US. We ended up defining another Dublin Core element on audience type. But the idea with GEM was that we had lots of different agencies that would keep lesson plans and materials for teachers. They would describe those materials in a Dublin Core schema. They would have those resident local on their servers, and we wrote harvesting software that would go from server to server to server, collect it, creating a union catalog, a joint repository of metadata that we could then build into a search engine, and you get the point. DSpace, Fedora, Greenstone, these are all software systems that have grown up around this concept of digital libraries. The idea that we have a large collection of objects, those objects need to have some durable place to put them, that metadata is our access point to those, that we can represent the relationships within them with things like RDF, with Greenstone, that we can present them in interesting ways back. The focus, though, of these digital libraries is always around things like digitization. Either we have born digital items where we worry about a workflow, which is how is this object created, how is it described, how does it end up? Or we deal with physical objects and a workflow, how does this get captured, what's the physical means of capture, what format do we put it in, what metadata do we assign it, and where do we store it, and how can we see it over long term? A focus on metadata and organizational schema. Almost from the beginning, digital libraries have been about how do we describe these objects, almost always looking at some external way of describing the objects, in the sense that we create a metadata record that can move with the object or apart from the object. And a focus on archives, keeping digital stuff around for a long time. And so we end up with things like the National Science Digital Library. Now, once again, I will take some blame here. This is a service that I was part of. But what you're seeing is, if you go to nsdl.org and you say that you are interested in K-12. Now, K-12 is the United States way of saying primary and secondary education. For us, that's kindergarten through grade 12. You click on Get Grade 12, and you're presented with a search interface at the top there. So you throw in a term, and it throws back a bunch of stuff. As you can see, 6,136 items related to chemistry. Good luck. Go through them and see what you need. You even get a little metadata to help you. A title, a description, format, related items, etc. So, hey, congratulations, success. This is exactly what teachers want to see, is I have no idea what I'm searching for. Good luck. Or you end up with things like DSpace repositories. Yeehaw! How exciting. Really, really interesting. This one's at the State University of New York, the Cortland, SUNY Cortland. And I'm guessing if you've never been to Cortland, New York, you have absolutely no idea what Cortland, New York is like. Right? If you look at this screen, what do you get? You get a search box and something that says archives. I mean, really, where do you go with this? What's the life of this system? What's in there? Why is it in there? What's this community look like? What does it feel like? Well, all right, we'll get there in a second. More results. The results. Focus on digital artifacts. Focus on stuff, right? It's divorced from context, right? It's organized by experts, not by how the thing's used, but by how the things are put into a system. And services are secondary. We'll get to services in a second. My point of all of this is that it's about the stuff and not about the use of the stuff. Right? It's digital library is taking the word library, sucking all the life out of it, and turning it into a building full of books. Except we put it in digital form, so it becomes a computer full of records. right? You don't understand why it's there, what the life is, who you're going to interact with, who you're going to bump into, who you're going to get coffee. It's not about the community that built that library. It's about the stuff in it. Think about libraries you've gone into. Think about libraries you will go into. Go in one in Parma. Go into the university library and then go one in Oslo and go back home. And do they look the same? Do they feel the same? The books and stacks might, but the people behind the desk don't. The signs certainly read different languages. You get a feel for what's going on. Now, before I get too much into that, clearly that's where I'm going to head. This notion is that services are secondary, and what do I mean by that? Well, what I mean by that is that in digital libraries, if you focus on lots of digital objects organized by a schema, put into some sort of repository, you sort of miss the fact that you got to do something with it, like search it. So let me show you what happened. This came out of a conversation I was having with a fellow by the name of Carl Lugosi, and we were working in the National Science Digital Library. And we were giving a presentation. We needed to start talking about services in NSDL. Now, the reason we were giving a presentation called Services of NSDL is when the National Science Foundation in the United States set up this digital library. They said, okay, what we're going to do is give out a number of grants to build stuff. The first set of grants are going to be the collections. So we're going to give out 10, 20 grants to people with stuff to digitize their stuff, to create collections of their stuff. So they went to things like one group built a collection of 3D molecule models. They built really cool models of caffeine and water and all these different molecules that you could look at in the classroom. Another group, don't ask me how this worked, was dealing with Confucian texts. And so they were digitizing original text and putting that up. One group was capturing lesson plans and materials from what they called indigenous mathematics, so that in different cultures there are different ways of doing math. So I grew up in the United States, and we work on a base 10 system, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and decimals and all that. Some cultures have base 5, some cultures have base 16, some cultures have base, actually was it base 15, which is why we ended up with a 24-hour clock. Anyway, odd stuff. Anyway, so they're going to build collections. They're going to build these wonderful digital collections. Then we're going to give a series of grants to services. So we're going to pay people to go out and develop services like search. So someone's going to develop a piece of software over here that can search all the stuff over there. Right? Another group over on the services side was going to build a way that they could take information from the collection side and visualize them. So all those 3D models could suddenly be rotating around on your screen. And there were other things like annotation services. You could pull up a lesson plan and put what you thought was a good idea. And in the middle was the group called the Core Integration Group. And they were going to magically bring all of these things together so that you could build it and look at a beautifully integrated, unified interface. Something happened along the way to integration, though, which is when the service people showed up at the doorstep of the collection people, they ran into problems. Like, for example, the service people would say, hand me your metadata. And the collection people would say, meta what? They didn't get any money to produce metadata. Now, what's interesting is they didn't get any money nor had any training to develop things like Dublin Core metadata or all this stuff. But it turns out they built their own, right? The search people from the server side walked over and said, we're going to search your stuff. Meanwhile, all the collection said, well, we already built a search interface. Because what happened was the collection folks is they would digitize their materials and they say, well, we got to put it someplace. Let's put it on the web. And well, we can't. We just put an alphabetical listing on the web. We got to make a nice little navigation system. So they built a taxonomy. And we got to, not have people go through every individual file. So they put a search engine up. And then they said, well, we can't just, maybe we want to let people rate which is a good service and a bad service. So they put an annotation service up. So what happened was, what we quickly realized in this situation is it was impossible to build a collection without building a service. That in fact everything in a digital library is a service. Digital libraries are not collections of materials. Digital libraries are collections of services. One of those services is access, but only one of them. The idea that I can give you a URL and tell you to go to a file is a service, because I don't have to do it. The digital file exists anyway. By putting it on the internet and giving it a URL, I've done you a service. And in fact, the URL I give you implies a lot to it, like how did I organize the taxonomy of stuff there? Is that out of a database, meaning that it's some sort of get URL, or is that a straight URL where I have a flat file on the back end? How I organize it, where I put it, how fast that server is, if I make it available to search engines or don't make it available to search engines, if I put metadata in it or don't put metadata in it, if it's got a cascading style sheet associated with it, all of that is modifying digital objects for use, hence a service. So everything in a digital library, from the URL you provide to the search engine you provide, to whether you provide the download capability or search capability or an image or a movie or whatever, is a service. When you are building digital libraries, you're building a service. And that means that everything you do in a digital library has to be evaluated and thought through and specified by its eventual consumer. If you do not take into consideration the user, if you do not think about who is going to be doing what with your stuff, then you're going to fail. You're going to build beautiful collections of artifacts that will get no use. So other problems in this sort of functional approach. First of all, a low usage of institutional repositories. Over the past 5 years, maybe 6 years, academic libraries all over the world have looked at institutional repositories as the solution. That what they were going to do is people weren't walking into the building anymore, and it was becoming really expensive to license commercial databases, so what they would do is capture everything from their institution, their dissertations, their theses, their published papers, their preprints. They would make an institutional repository, and they would be useful again. And no one came. They built lots of institutional repositories that no one knew other than the librarian why. We'll get back to that in a second. Very low user participation in digital libraries. I remember very early discussions on digital libraries where the golden grail was having people come, look at your stuff, and add their own, or comment on it. When all the scientists were providing information for teachers to come and use in the classroom, they thought they would leave their lesson plans. They never did. And they sort of tried to figure out why, because then suddenly Flickr and YouTube came and everyone was adding stuff. Why weren't they adding stuff to the digital libraries? I'll give you a hint. A lot of it was, imagine that YouTube and Flickr and these kinds of services are services for you to organize your stuff. And digital libraries saw them as a way for you to enhance my stuff. What is in it for you to enhance my stuff? Right? Digital libraries are sort of branded. It would be like people walking into their public library and starting to reorganize the books. We don't do that. But actually, that's what people want to do. And there's, in a digital world, no reason not to. But we'll get to that in a second. There was no way to define what a standard service was. Is search a standard service? Everyone sort of agreed on that. Visualization? Reference, asking questions? Probably not. That's expensive. What is it? Archiving, backup, sorting, visualization, lockers? What is it? And the problem of multivalent documents. Now, what's a multivalent document? Well, imagine if you take a document, bloop, right? That's my representation for a document. And let's say it's, once again, this little molecule, this H2O water molecule you can spin around. I'm a teacher, I'm going to use it in a classroom. So I take that document, I take that object, and I say, well, gee, this is how it fits into my lesson plan. I'm going to teach them what water is, I'm going to teach them basic chemistry, and then I'm going to show them your model. And then someone takes that and says, well, that's part of a larger unit. When I teach in a classroom, I'm teaching science, right? And so where exactly do you apply your metadata? What exactly do you describe? What's the catalog entry? Is it for the molecule, the lesson plan, or the unit? And who does what, and for whom, and all these stuff, and it begins to get very confusing. The other major problem that people ran into was this. This is the current list of the top 10 websites on the internet. When you look at where people go and what people do, look at that list. it doesn't feel very digital library-like. Google? Facebook? Is Facebook a digital library of people? How do you do a catalog record for it? YouTube and Yahoo, right? We got lots of search services. Blogger.com, where people produce materials, not very digital library-like. Twitter, not at all digital library-like. But you say, aha, I got you, Dave. Because clearly YouTube and Wikipedia are very digital library-like. They're big collections of stuff that's organized. And I go, yeah, but let's walk back to this logic, because it doesn't fit. Our logic of digital libraries was that we have stuff, we organize that stuff, and we provide access to it. And that's not what's happening here. Let's take a look at Wikipedia. Compare Wikipedia in August of 2004. Set your mind back to August of 2004, all of 6 years ago. And compare Wikipedia with Microsoft Encarta. All right? Now, which would you have said is going to win this war? Which is the best online encyclopedia? Is it the one that has a large established editorial base with expert editors and a lot of clarified and approved content that's already been put into a product, that the CD-ROM version is the most widely used CD-ROM encyclopedia in the world? Or is it going to be a bunch of people that put up a little PHP engine where anyone could add to it? Right? That's what Wikipedia was. Come put stuff in. Who would have predicted that the large multinational, largest technology company on earth at the time was going to, in essence, over the next 6 years, fail miserably? Right? Now, in hindsight, we can look back and say, oh, Dave, it's Web 2.0 and people could contribute, and we'll get there. But at the time, this defied logic, to the point where Wikipedia is now the most widely used encyclopedia, and Encarta has actually gone offline and been discontinued as a product. Right? So if you follow the logic of digital libraries, expert organization to good content that's well organized and maintained and managed, it failed miserably. Letting people come in and do their own thing and own stuff and build tools and add their own content suddenly works very well. So this functional logic of librarianship doesn't work. Right? This is an artifact-centric approach to digital libraries. The mission of this approach, the mission of a digital library in this world is to concentrate and access digital objects. Put a lot of good stuff together and provide access to it. And when you do that, it doesn't necessarily work. You run into lots of problems. It becomes very stagnant. It doesn't match what a lot of people want and what they're doing. So what can we put in place of it? And this, I suppose, is where we're moving into the future. And I would argue that what we do is we build off of the true mission of libraries and librarians. This comes out of a concept we're calling the new librarianship. And it goes that the mission of a librarian, and by extension a library, is to improve society through facilitating knowledge creation in their communities. All right? And like I say, extending this to the digital library world, the mission of a digital library is to improve society through facilitating knowledge creation in communities. Now, this is a very different view of things. Why do libraries have books and materials and shelves? Because at the time that those collections were built, it was the most efficient and effective way to build knowledge. The book, the printed word, is one of the most successful technologies in the history of mankind. Right? But don't think it's a piece of cake to use. In many countries, it takes about 6 years of formal education to learn how to use that particular technology and device. And some would say with master's education, it takes you 15, 18, 24 years to figure out how to produce those kinds of tools. But my point of that is they're just tools. The reason that we built buildings and put them full of books was because they were so scarce. The scarcity of those items, having them together by creating a critical mass of objects together in a place with trained professionals and a community, allowed us to fulfill this mission of knowledge creation and community. But the mission was knowledge creation, not collection. That was a means to an end. If you take this mission and talk about digital libraries, which is, wait, if what I'm trying to do is not build a digital place for lots of stuff, but to build a conceptual place for people to learn, it changes things radically. First of all, what are the characteristics of a participatory digital library, of a library built in knowledge and built on learning and not built on stuff? Well, first of all, it's a collection of services. We had this discussion, right? We're just going to acknowledge it from the beginning, that our digital library is a collection of services. One of those services is access. Another is the structures that we provide, the taxonomies, the metadata, the schemas. Another is search, whatever it is. Where do we define that collection of services? In the community, right? It's what the community needs to learn. If this particular community needs to have it in a given language, it will be in that language. If this community needs to have it in 4 languages, it will be in 4 languages. If this community needs visualization, we will build a visualizer. The definition doesn't come from what is a digital library. The definition comes from what does the community need, right? First massive change. Second, that one of the digital libraries, what we call a participatory digital library, allows for user-supplied organizations. That in essence, when people come to sort through and find their materials, part of how they learn is to organize things. Think about your own notes. Think about how you learn something. When you go to learn something, don't you, in essence, create a scheme of adding it together? As you're learning about a topic, you say, well, this goes for this folder, creates for this class, or these notes go to that lecture, or these books relate to this topic. You're organizing the world around you, not me organizing it for you. Nextly, the digital library provides tools for content creation. Most of the content for an effective digital library does not exist when you launch the digital library. Most of that content will come from the users and the use of that system, not from what you anticipate to be. So what we need to do is build a vessel, build a structure for people to fill in their own content and their own material, not just the stuff we provide. This library will provide conversation opportunities that match the norms of the communities. So if you're building a digital library for PhDs in physics, you can use a very high-level language and talk about bosons and particles and electrons. But if you're building it for the K-12 population, you use very different language. So we also have to understand that if we're going to have scientists and students in the same place, we need to let them know that these are places where they're going to have to talk to each other, and here's places where they can have their own language in their own room, etc. And this is probably one of the major differences when we look at digital libraries in the future. Instead of looking at building a digital library as a place on the web that people come to, what we look at is a series of content and services, it's all services, a series of tools that go to the user. So wherever those conversations are occurring, if they occur in Facebook, then our digital library is going to have a Facebook app. If it occurs in a mobile world, we're going to build an iPhone app, or we're going to build an Android app, or we're going to build a mobile web interface, or an SMS, a text-based interface to them. We're going to look where our users and our community are learning, and that's where we are going to be, as opposed to saying, here's our URL, come to us. Now let's just take one of these characteristics. Let's take the allows for user-supplied organization. What do I mean by that? Well, let's say that this is your digital library, and these different colored dots represent the sort of major sections of information, right? Think of them as your documents, right? These are our physics documents and our biology documents and our chemistry documents, etc., right? And this is how you see them being organized, right? This is the path you should go through. If you want to learn this world, this is the way to look at it. But now imagine that users get into this, and we allow the users to go wherever they want. And in fact, we've seen this on the web all the time. You can build a great pathfinder to the web. People are going to start at Google and then surf around. And what we can begin to do with digital tools is we can track where they go. So that a user comes in and says, I think this is how the order they go in. These things are related, these things are related, these things are related. I disagree with you. And what we can do is we can watch multiple users going through the system, each building their own way. But over time, what we might find is that certain organizations, a large number of users, begin to always use the same order, the same structure. Now, if you're familiar at all with the notion of tagging or tag clouds, That's exactly what you're seeing here. People using the same terminology, the same tags, and when we look across multiple users, certain of those tags gain specific meaning. But I will warn you, one of the differences when you, and I'm not getting too deep into the theory behind all of this, but the problem with tagging is we need to move away from looking at objects and look at relationships. Because in the importance, the way you know something isn't as individual discrete pieces of knowledge. You look at them as relationships of ideas and facts and opinions together. So this is looking at how these things are organized. So to this group of people, to the majority of these people, they would actually organize your information this way. Now, in a digital context, this is once again the idea of users going into your library and beginning to move the books around. But in a digital context, there's no reason that says that your system has to disappear. This just becomes another one of these systems. So that a new user may pick either one of these. Or an experienced user may only have their own. Or each user may have their own. So you may have 500,000 users coming to your site and have 500,000 different ways of organizing your materials. And it just doesn't matter because with the digital tools, that's no big deal. Now, the other thing that we can do here is I mentioned that part of a digital library is a lot of the content's not there. Because if we provide the tools for people to now link to add content, add links to content outside of your system, we can be constantly enhancing and looking at new materials and new resources that we never knew of or thought to include ourselves. And so when someone says, well, gee, this red object here is related to something in a local resource that no one can see but me, but I can put that link in. And someone else can say, well, this orange resource, that's very much related to this article, and this article was turned into a very interesting YouTube movie. And this article is related to a piece of music, and this is a person that I talked to about this, and this is an answer, an interview that I had with someone. And so suddenly, people are going in, and they're building their own collections of materials. You become a starting off point, right? And that's another major shift that we're seeing, which is instead of trying to develop every piece of functionality into your digital library. Instead of looking at digital library as a way of anticipating every potential use, what we look at is a digital library as a set of small individual tools that can be combined by a user in whatever order they want. So think about something like Facebook. And if you haven't been on Facebook, go on Facebook. Facebook is a very, very simple system when you look at it. All it really does is let you create a profile, add friends, and have a wall. 3 things. Right? Then what it does is it has a system where you can add other functionality. So now I want to play Farmville. And now I want to have the top 10 movies I've ever seen. And now I want to link it to my Twitter account. And now I want to link it over to show you this cool movie I did and show my pictures. And the point of all of these, when you get to all these functions, that's very unique to me. That as a user, I am building a set of functionality. I'm orchestrating the functionality around me in little pieces that I'm putting together, rather than, you will do these things. This is the system you must go through. Right? And the other example is in a mobile application. So here's my iPhone, right? So, magic iPhone. And pick a device of your choosing. But if you think about it, am I a user of this phone? Well, yes, Dave, you consume it. But the apps that I have on my phone and the apps that you have on your phone are probably different. And so am I truly a user of this, or am I basically a user of each one of these individual little pieces of application, but the whole aggregation of those apps, all of them put together, is uniquely mine. I'm an author of that combination. Right? So if you think about your digital library, do you provide everyone all the apps they'll ever need, or one big app that does everything? Or do you provide them with the App Store where they can pick and choose what they want to do and how they do it? And it's that creation, that whole system that's your digital library, but you've allowed them to build something that's very individualized for themselves. All right. Other characteristic we talked about, provides conversational opportunities that match the norms of the community. So we have this document, this digital object, or this service, by the way. And people looking at that, you might say, well, they might have very different views of that object, right? So we take that chemistry molecule. So here's the 3D representation of caffeine, molecule caffeine, which is very interesting, right? Well, the doctors, the medical folks might look at this as an interesting way of looking at building pharmaceuticals that can enhance, can neutralize the effect of caffeine, can do whatever, right? The mothers might look at this as a way of saying, what are the potential downfalls, nutritional information. The t-shirt guy might want to know, how do I make a cool t-shirt with caffeine, because I think that'll sell lots of t-shirts. Each group is going to have a different way of referring to and talking about that object. And each group is going to search for it differently, is going to store it in a different place, is going to relate it to different objects. So the t-shirt manufacturer is going to relate caffeine to a 50-50 cotton blend. And the medical folks are going to represent it to a neuroreceptor. And the mothers are going to represent it to the kinds of drinks they want to serve their kids. Right? But the point is that each community has a different view of that object. Your library, rather than say, this is the right one, your obligation as a builder is to understand which of these communities do you want to serve and what do they look at when they organize that information and match it. Next characteristic, once again, is that we go to where the conversation is, which is the t-shirt manufacturer and the nurse and the mother are probably not all sitting in the same room. Some of them are having their conversations on hospital websites, some of them are having on Facebook, some of them are having on email listservs, some of them are having a mobile phone conversation. Our technology should be able to be implemented in any of these environments by creating a series of RESTful interfaces or APIs that we can embed that information in lots of different systems, not just if they come to our URL. So if we go back to the idea of repositories, and I said before we come back to it briefly, instead of looking like this, right, which is, this is what DSpace looks like, come and find stuff, it's going to start looking like this. This is the Public Library of Science. It's a science journal, open access journal, and it's got a repository and archive of academic literature and biology. But if you look at this page, it's got editorial picks, it's got what's peer-reviewed and what's not, it's highlighting certain information, not highlighting certain information. An academic looks at this and says, I know this world. I know Public Library of Science. That feels like a journal to me. That feels like a conference to me. That feels like a community that I'm part of. They look over at the DSpace and they're like, what's that? That's a big bucket that's got some metadata and I don't know what metadata is. Right? We look at services. Instead of building services that look like this, these are virtual reference services. You fill in your name, your email, your address, your question, and you get this nice little chat back and forth, and then they can push pages. It might start looking like this. This is a system called Scapes. You'll see a URL at the bottom there that you can take a look at. But the idea here is that imagine walking into a library. Now, in a traditional library, at least in the States and in other nationalities, if you have a question, you go up to a reference librarian, a reference desk, and you ask a question. That's very much what the model on that side of the screen looks like, the traditional model. Imagine instead you walked into a library and they said, here's your table. And what you do is you sit at the table and you begin taking books and materials you've read and you begin putting them in piles. And you begin inviting friends and other folks around to help you figure out these piles. Well, this one agrees with this one, and this one disagrees. Well, have you read this one? And I'm going to call a librarian to help me, but I'm going to call my best friend, I'm going to call a professor, I'm going to call an expert. I'm going to pull them together, and suddenly we have this social work table that we're organizing information about. Let me walk you through a sort of related example. We were asked by our academic library to look at, could we redo their reserve systems? So if you go to an academic library in the United States, at least, and many other European universities, they have something called electronic reserves, where a professor has said, here are the readings for my class, please put them on reserve, so when my students come in, they know what to read for this class. So this is the existing system. First thing you do is you click on find reserves, because no one knows what that means except for librarians. And you get a system that looks like this that asks you who's your instructor, what department, what's the course number, etc. Fill out all that information, and it gives you back this big long list of here's the stuff you got to read. Well, we looked at this and we said, yeah, I think we can do better. And we came up with this as our first attempt. And we said, oh, what we need is, of course, we need my articles, my books, my classes, my feeds, my stuff, my friends. It's all got to be about me, right? And then we got to have friends. Got to have friends if it's social. Yeehaw, we have friends. And then we have the information up top, tag cloud, because tag clouds just reek of Web 2.0, and that's really cool. And we'll throw some Amazon data in there, so that's a mashup. And boy, we've done our job here. And we looked at this and we said, what in the world have we done? We've taken every possible function, thrown it at this thing, and pretended that somehow it matters. Right? What's the difference between my articles, my books? Now, to an undergrad, absolutely nothing. It's the stuff I have to read. And why do I have friends here? What do my friends care about the PDF file for this class? And it just doesn't necessarily make sense. We went back to the drawing board. We call this the PDF worship page. Ooh, all hail the PDF. And we said, we got to do better than this. And we started with the idea of what are we really dealing with? Well, if we've got classes, what's a class? A class is a conversation. This is a conversation. It's a one-way conversation, hopefully turning to a two-way conversation between you and me. Right? I am organizing this, but it's sort of my initial statement. And in a class, you get a syllabus. And the syllabus is the teacher's first guess on this is what we're going to talk about, and this is the order in which we're going to talk about them. Right? So that's our first conversation. Each class is its own conversation. We could also have, I'm writing my great novel. That could be another conversation. Or where am I going to go out on Friday night? That's another conversation. So we have my conversations. Now it's making sense. And conversations, you have conversations with people, some of which are your friends. Now friends make sense. Okay, I buy that. And we started with the syllabus. And so the syllabus is sitting there and saying, this is what I want you, this is what we're going to talk about. This is the related materials and the order in which we're going to go through them, right? So now I can look at, given this class, I want you to look at this document. And so if I look at that document, there's the little PDF stuff. Here it makes sense, right? Because I'm learning more about the document. It's all about the document. But now I know why I'm learning about the document, why I care, right? So I can relate this information together. And what's great about a syllabus is it's also a framework for furthering the conversation. Because not only does the syllabus tell you what we're going to talk about and in what order and what you're going to read, it also tells you what you're supposed to do about it, what assignments you have, how you're going to carry through on the assignments. And so I can have the syllabus not only point to the readings and materials, giving it context, I can also point to the results of the work. So as a student, I can now add to this scheme, add to this web of knowledge with, well, now I was supposed to take a picture. I took a picture. The picture reminded me of something, so I went and talked to the person who did it. So now I have that email address. And so you can imagine now this conversation growing. It's going to grow over time. And what we can also do is we can imagine that now within a class, I can say, well, let me see what everyone else had to say about this book. Right? So I can go in and look at all the notes from people reading that book. Right? So I can do that. So I can also add additional materials, and anyone can. Right? And now not only can I look at what my professor said about this book, what I said about my book, taking annotations, what my classmates said about the book, but I can ask, well, who else talked about this book? And it turns out that this book about digital libraries was also used in this class about archaeology. I never thought there was a relationship with archaeology. What's going on here? And suddenly, I can now follow this into whole new domains of knowledge. And I'm not limited by what the Dewey Decimal System or the Library of Congress classification system or any sort of existing schema say I can move, any sort of classification. I can now go and sort of follow the links that anyone creates about this knowledge. How this class linked to this book, linked to this resource, linked to this person, linked to this department, linked to whatever. Imagine you're sitting in that classroom now. If you were to tell the story about how you got into that classroom, would it be a nice straight line? I was born, I turned 5, at 6 I decided I wanted to go to a class on digital libraries in Parma, Italy, and then I did this and this and this, and then I ended up in the class, and then I, died happily. Right? No. Right? It starts with, well, I wandered over here for a while, and then I lost that job. And then I wandered over here for a while, and I found out I didn't want to be a physicist. And then I went, right? That wandering, that meandering, that way of you organizing doesn't just happen in your life choices. It happens in how you learn things, right? I learned PHP. Why did I learn PHP? Because C++ was too hard. And it turns out that once I got into PHP, it shaped how I looked at how I organized information and wrote information. And once I started writing information, it shaped how I looked at digital libraries, because now I realized anyone could create the knowledge. And so this way of sort of looking at knowledge as a messy web of information, where I am the author, not simply a consumer of one narrative about it, is what we should be representing in our digital libraries. Now, once again, so does the catalog here disappear in a traditional library? No, what we realized is we now had a very interesting way of migrating from an artifact-centric view over to this conversational view, right? So you can have this digital library of artifacts, books and materials and digital object identifiers and whatever, but as you provide people the tool to make new links that you never anticipated with this more knowledge-based system, suddenly you get this ability to migrate out and create a social environment, create a learning environment. And this isn't because it's hip and cool and Web 2.0 and everything's about social networking. We do it because this is how people learn. Think about when you have a problem in this class, what are you going to do first? You're probably going to, well, I'm going to read on something. Or are you going to turn to the person next to you going, do you get this? Or you're going to go to Anna Maria and go, does this make any sense to you? Or are you going to engage in a sense of conversation? Realize that most of the conversations that you're going to have are with yourself. That you actually, when you're reading, for example, you're having a conversation with yourself. You disagree. If you sat there and said, what does he mean by that? Who were you talking to? You were talking to yourself. It's okay. We do that. All right. So I've taken too much of your time. Hopefully we'll have time to go back and forth. But let me give you my big conclusions at the end here. First, existing technology streams will serve either this open and participatory library or a closed and curated collection. That's where I started, right? Notice that as I was talking about what we do and why we do it and the concepts, I didn't stop and say, now RDA won't do this and RDF won't do this and XML, because they will. Either way, you're building a big warehouse of stuff or you're building conversations, same technologies work in both worlds. That the future of digital libraries is a matter of conceptual foundation, not technology. Everything I've talked to you about today is not because technology allows us to do it, it's because there's a philosophy around, am I providing access to things or am I providing a means of learning? Radically, radically different things. Access to learning is insufficient for learning. If access was sufficient, I would drop you off into the Italian library of your choice, show up 2 weeks later and expect you to speak fluent Italian. It doesn't work that way. Access is insufficient for learning, and digital libraries are about learning. So we have to take in the whole world of learning, not simply the access side. That's a philosophical difference and a conceptual difference, not a technical one. That you must build these instruments of learning, not warehouses of objects, because ultimately warehouses of objects may have some utility, but that utility is fleeting and ultimately won't lead to our larger goal of learning. It won't improve the world that we're around. I love the idea that in certain parts of the world, having access to 100 books is an invaluable collection. Absolutely. In other places in the world, having access to 100 books is a paltry collection. The point isn't the books, and it's not even the number. The point is, what do they have access to, and what's its utility? Right? For my children upstairs, the 10-year-old, having access to books is vitally important. For me as a professor, having access to books is almost irrelevant because everything I'm doing, I'm reading either online or in journals, and most of those journals are going online. The point with both of us is that those systems we're building are about learning, not about book acquisitions or journal acquisitions. Digital libraries should serve both of us, not necessarily at the same time. Right? And lastly, and then I will shut up and hopefully we can have a conversation. The best way to predict the future is to invent it. If you want to know what the future of digital libraries are, what the future of digital libraries is, look around. Look to the person left, look to the person right, and look in the mirror. You are the future. What you decide, what you build, the time you take, the people you teach, the efforts you make, that's the future. The future won't come from a book, the future won't come from a professor across the ocean. The future won't come from a Skype conversation. The future will be dictated by the person who sits down at the computer and produces code. The future will be produced by the person who goes back to their country and finds the funding or provides the funding or makes the argument for the funding to build that digital library. You're the future of digital libraries, not me and not that technology. And I hope that when you look at that future and when you look at the possibility that you bring to it, you're going to talk about knowledge and learning and not about stuff and materials. Because that's ultimately what we're trying to do. All right, I'm going to shut up and hopefully we'll have a conversation about this. Thank you very much.